So we've looked at data binding from the XAML side. Now let's look at data binding from the code side. First of all, we'll open up the XAML CS file that goes along with the main page. When we look at the constructor, we can see that in addition to the initialize component call, we have two more lines. The first one sets the data context for this page to the value of the viewModel property on the app class. We'll go look at how that's set up in a minute. But in addition, it also sets the loaded event to point to a new event handler called mainPageLoaded. So this is an alternative way of getting the page loaded event to be called compared to the XAML version that we used in the Units Converter app. Since we know that we have our list of sonnets on the main page, we have a selection changed, and we'll dig into how all this works in the next movie, but this is where we determine which sonnet is selected and navigate off to the details page. And if we come down to the page loaded call, this is a way of making sure that the data has actually been loaded from the external file. This says if the data loaded property on the viewModel is set to false, we call the load data method on that viewModel to get it to load its data. If we go and look at the app class, we'll see it has a viewModel instance variable and a viewModel property, which simply says when somebody tries to get this, if that instance variable is null, we new up a new instance of the viewModel class. And if we go and look at the viewModel class, we'll see that it is a traditional Mvvm iNotify property changed implementation, and that's what makes it work to bind the data between the class and Silverlight and the XAML. In our case, we're not changing any of the data, so the properties won't change other than the fact that we're loading new data into it. But this is a standard way of doing data binding. Right now we're using what's called one-way data binding just from our data to the screen. You could, in subsequent apps that you build, end up using two-way data binding so that if the user changes something on the screen, it actually changes something in the model. There's our sample property. There's our isDataLoaded property. And here in the default template is where the data for the viewModel is actually instantiated. In fact, let's go ahead and run this app right now so you can see what happens with the template straight out of the box. Remember that you saw in the XAML, we'll go take a look at it, for the main page, we open up the designer again. We see design 1, design 2, and design 3. When we run it, come back over here to the viewModel, you'll see that it's instantiating instances of the item viewModel class and filling it in with runtime 1, runtime 2, and so forth. So let's run this. Press F5, and we'll see there's our runtime data. Again, this is all still canned data, but it shows you how if you simply wanted to make a real simple app that only had fixed data, all you'd have to do is modify this load data method. In our case, when we complete our app, we're actually going to load the data from an external file. Before we complete our examination of the Mvvm pattern, let's go take a look at the definition of item viewModel, because we're going to be using that throughout this particular app and the next two. So here, item viewModel is yet another implementation of iNotify property changed, which has three properties: line 1, line 2, and line 3. That's it. 3 strings, and you're good with the standard notify property changed mechanism that implements that iNotify property changed interface. That's our Mvvm overview. Let's move on now to looking at how the two pages interact with each other in order to implement the master detail pattern using Windows Phone Pages.